The howl pierced the Montana night like a silver blade, sending a chill down Daisy Zimmerman's spine that had nothing to do with the October chill of 1878. She froze beside her small campfire, the rabbit she'd been cooking forgotten as her hand instinctively moved to the Winchester rifle propped against her saddle. The wolves had been trailing her for 2 days now, growing bolder as her supplies dwindled, and her horse had gone lame. Tonight, they'd finally decided she was weak enough to take. Another howl answered the first, closer this time. Daisy's breathing quickened as she got to her feet, rifle in hand. At 22, she'd seen her share of hardship since leaving Philadelphia, but nothing had prepared her for being alone in wolf territory with winter approaching. The firelight flickered across her dirt-smudged face as she peered into the darkness, trying to locate the predators by sound alone. The first pair of eyes appeared at the edge of her camp, twin emerald orbs reflecting her firelight, then another set, and another. Daisy counted 7 pairs surrounding her, the wolves staying just beyond the circle of light cast by her small fire. "Get back!" she shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. The wolves scattered momentarily but regrouped quickly, emboldened by hunger and the scent of her fear. She fired again, this time aiming for the largest wolf, but in her panic, the bullet went wide. The lead wolf snarled, lowering its massive head and taking a step forward into the light. Daisy's hands trembled as she tried to reload. The wolves sensed her vulnerability and began to close in. She fumbled with the cartridge, dropping it into the dirt at her feet. That's when the first shot came from the darkness beyond her camp, not from her rifle, but from somewhere in the trees to her right. Then another, and another. The night exploded with gunfire, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. Wolves yelped and scattered as bullet after bullet slammed into the ground around them or found flesh. Daisy dropped to her knees behind her saddle, clutching her rifle to her chest as the barrage continued. The gunfire seemed to come from a single source, moving methodically around the perimeter of her camp. One by one, the wolf eyes disappeared from the darkness until the night fell silent again except for the pounding of her heart. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" A figure emerged from the trees, tall and broad-shouldered, the silhouette of a cowboy, hat unmistakable against the night sky. He approached slowly, rifle held casually at his side, spurs jingling with each step. "Madam," he said simply, stepping into the firelight. "Looks like you had yourself some unwelcome visitors." Daisy stared up at him, taking in his weathered face, the thick, dark beard that couldn't hide his strong jawline, and eyes that seemed almost gold in the firelight. He couldn't have been much older than 30, though the wilderness had etched lines around his eyes that made him look seasoned rather than aged. Thank you," she managed, still clutching her rifle. "They've been following me since yesterday." "Name's August Lawson," he said, kneeling to add wood to her dwindling fire. "Most folks call me Gus, heard the shots and figured someone might be in trouble." "Daisy Zimmerman," she replied, watching him cautiously. "I'm headed to Helena. My horse went lame about 10 miles back." Gus nodded, surveying her camp with practiced eyes. "You're a good 30 miles from Helena still, Miss Zimmerman, and these parts ain't kind to lone travelers, especially with a wolf pack hunting." "I didn't have much choice," Daisy said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "My uncle died 3 weeks ago in Bozeman. I'm to meet my cousin in Helena who's arranged passage for me back east." Gus settled himself across the fire from her, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Well, Miss Zimmerman, seems to me you've got 2 choices. You can try making Helena on foot with wolves on your trail, or you can accept some help from a stranger." Daisy hesitated. Her father had always warned her about the dangers that awaited a woman alone in the West, but the wolves would return, and she'd been lucky tonight. "She might not be so fortunate tomorrow. What kind of help are you offering, Mr. Lawson? I've got a cabin about 3 miles east of here. My horse can carry us both that far. In the morning, I can take you to Helena." He held up his hands when he saw the wariness in her eyes. "You'll have the cabin to yourself. I'll sleep in the stable with the horses." The sincerity in his voice gave her pause. After a moment's consideration, Daisy nodded. "I'd be grateful for the assistance, Mr. Lawson." "Let's gather your things then," he said, rising to his feet. Those wolves might decide to come back with reinforcements. As Daisy packed her meager belongings, she couldn't help but study the man who had appeared like a guardian angel in her darkest moment. His movements were efficient and purposeful, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness around them. When he helped her onto his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, his hands were strong but gentle at her waist. They rode in silence through the night, Daisy perched in front of Gus on the saddle, acutely aware of his chest against her back and his arms around her as he held the reins. The scent of leather, tobacco, and pine clung to him, not unpleasant. She found herself thinking, true to his word, Gus's cabin appeared after about an hour's ride. It was small but sturdy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by pines. A stable stood nearby, and a small stream gurgled somewhere in the darkness. "It ain't much," he said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it keeps the rain out and the warmth in." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's dwelling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs nearby. A bed with a patchwork quilt stood in one corner, and shelves lined with books occupied another, something Daisy hadn't expected from a frontier cowboy. "You read?" she asked, surprised. Gus smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Winter nights get long out here. Man's got to keep his mind sharp somehow." He built a fire while Daisy stood awkwardly in the center of the room, still processing the rapid change in her circumstances. When the flames were crackling, Gus straightened and collected a blanket from a trunk. "There's food in the pantry if you're hungry, water in the barrel by the door." He paused at the threshold. "Lock the door behind me, Miss Zimmerman. I'll be in the stable if you need anything." After he left, Daisy did as instructed, sliding the wooden bolt into place. She stood for a moment with her back against the door, surveying what would be her shelter for the night. Despite her exhaustion, curiosity drew her to the bookshelves. Volumes of Shakespeare nestled alongside practical guides to animal husbandry and frontier medicine. A collection of poetry by Whitman. Scientific journals. August Lawson was not what she had expected from a man of the West. She ate a simple meal of bread and dried beef from his pantry, washed her face and hands in the basin, and finally allowed herself to sink onto the edge of his bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw but covered with clean linens that smelled of sunlight and herbs. Daisy removed her boots and outer garments but kept her chemise and petticoat on, sliding under the quilt, fully prepared to bolt if necessary. But as she lay there, listening to the crackling fire and the distant hooting of an owl, she felt safer than she had in weeks. The image of August Lawson firing into the night, driving away the wolves that would have surely killed her, played behind her closed eyelids as she drifted into an exhausted sleep. Morning came with the scent of coffee and bacon. Daisy opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through the single window of the cabin and Gus moving quietly at the hearth, where a cast iron skillet sizzled over the coals. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said when he noticed her stirring. "Thought you might be hungry before we head out." Daisy sat up, hastily smoothing her tangled auburn hair. "What time is it?" "Just past 7, Gus replied, sliding eggs onto 2 tin plates. "We should reach Helena by mid-afternoon if we leave within the hour." Daisy accepted the plate he offered, surprised again by the domesticity of this solitary mountain man. "Thank you for everything," Gus nodded, taking a seat at the table with his own breakfast. "No need for thanks. Wouldn't be right to leave someone to the wolves, figurative or literal." As they ate, Daisy studied him in the daylight. His features were even more striking than they had appeared in the firelight's strong cheekbones. A straight nose that had clearly been broken at least once, and those unusual amber eyes framed by dark lashes. His beard was neatly trimmed, not wild as many frontier men wore theirs. "Have you lived out here long?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. 5 years, he answered. "Came west after the war, tried my hand at ranching for a spell but preferred the solitude." He glanced at her. "What about you? Philadelphia, you said," Daisy nodded. "Born and raised. My father was a banker. After he and mother died of influenza 3 years ago, I came west to stay with my uncle in Bozeman. He was my only remaining family, aside from the cousin in Helena." "I'm sorry for your losses," Gus said, his voice genuinely sympathetic. "The West can be unforgiving. "So I'm learning," Daisy said with a small smile, though it has its moments of unexpected kindness as well. A hint of color touched Gus's cheeks and he stood to clear their plates. "We should get moving. Your cousin will be worried." They set out under a clear blue October sky, Daisy once again riding in front of Gus on his stallion. Her lame horse, a gentle mare named Willow, had been tethered behind them, walking without the burden of a rider. The day was crisp but not uncomfortable, and Daisy found herself relaxing against Gus's solid presence as they rode through forests and across open meadows. "How did you learn to shoot like that?" she asked after they'd been traveling for an hour or so. "Last night, I mean." "It was too dark to see properly, but you hit your mark every time." "Served as a sharpshooter during the war," Gus replied, his voice measured. "Developed an ear for movement as much as an eye for targets." "You fought for the Union?" "Yes, madam, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, Burden's men." Daisy absorbed this information silently. The war had ended 13 years ago, but its shadows still lingered across the nation. Her own father had paid for a substitute rather than serve, something that had caused tension in their household whenever the subject arose. "My uncle fought at Antietam," she offered. "Lost his arm there." Gus was quiet for a moment. "I was there too." They fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them and the vast beauty of the Montana wilderness made conversation seem unnecessary. Occasionally, Gus would point out a hawk circling overhead or the tracks of a deer crossing their path, and Daisy would marvel at his knowledge of the land. As the sun climbed higher, they stopped by a creek to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of jerky and hard biscuits from Gus's saddlebag. Daisy removed her boots and stockings to dip her feet in the cold water, sighing with relief at the sensation. "Were you planning to return east right away?" Gus asked as he refilled their canteens. Daisy wiggled her toes in the current, considering. "That was the plan. My cousin Margaret has arranged for me to stay with her mother-in-law in Boston until I can find suitable employment as a companion or governess." "Sounds proper," Gus said, and Daisy caught a hint of something like disappointment in his tone. "It's what's expected," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "A woman alone has limited options. The West has opportunities that the East doesn't," Gus observed. "Women homesteaders, businesswomen, teachers who run their own schools." Daisy looked at him then, curious about the conviction in his voice. "You sound like you've given it some thought." "My sister was widowed young," he explained. "Came west and built herself a new life, runs a successful millinery shop in Denver now." He shrugged. "Just saying there are choices is all." The idea settled in Daisy's mind like a seed as they continued their journey. She had accepted her cousin's arrangements without question, assuming that returning east was her only viable option. But perhaps that was simply because it was the path of least resistance, the expected course for a woman of her background. As they approached Helena in the late afternoon, the wilderness gave way to signs of civilization, fenced fields, the occasional farmhouse, and finally the outskirts of the growing city itself. Helena had boomed after gold was discovered in Last Chance Gulch, and even though the initial rush had subsided, the city remained vibrant and expanding. "Where does your cousin live?" Gus asked as they rode down the main street, passing saloons, mercantiles, and hotels. "Clancy Street," Daisy replied. "Number 18. It's supposed to be one of the newer neighborhoods." Gus nodded, guiding his horse through the busy thoroughfare. Daisy felt a strange reluctance growing within her as they drew closer to their destination. In just 24 hours, August Lawson had become a fixed point in her unstable world, reliable, solid, unexpectedly thoughtful. The prospect of saying goodbye left her with an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. Number 18 Clancy Street turned out to be an imposing two-story house with a freshly painted white picket fence and curtained windows. Gus brought the horse to a stop at the gate, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the comfortable home. "This is it," he said unnecessarily. Daisy didn't move immediately, her hands gripping the saddle horn. "Yes," she finally replied. "This is it." Gus dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Daisy found herself looking into those amber eyes, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Thank you," she managed at last, "for saving my life." "It was my pleasure, Miss Zimmerman," he replied formally, though his eyes conveyed something deeper. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "For your journey east, some jerky and biscuits, train food can be wanting." Daisy accepted the humble offering, touched by the gesture. "That's very kind." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when the front door of the house opened and a woman in an elegant day dress emerged onto the porch. "Daisy, is that you? We've been worried sick." The woman called, hurrying down the steps. "Margaret," Daisy confirmed as her cousin approached, her expression shifting between relief and curiosity as she noted Gus standing beside her. "We expected you 2 days ago. What happened, and who is this gentleman?" Margaret's gaze swept over Gus with undisguised assessment, taking in his frontier clothing and weathered appearance. "This is Mr. August Lawson," Daisy said quickly. "My horse went lame and I was stranded. Mr. Lawson came to my aid when wolves surrounded my camp. He saved my life." Margaret's eyes widened. "Wolves? Oh, my dear, how terrifying." She turned to Gus with a more appraising look. "We are in your debt, Mr. Lawson. You must come in for refreshments at the very least." Gus shifted uncomfortably, his hat now in his hands. "That's kind of you, madam, but I should be heading back before dark." "Nonsense," Margaret insisted. "Richard would want to thank you properly, and you must be hungry after your journey." Before Gus could protest further, Margaret had taken charge, instructing a stable boy who appeared from the side of the house to tend to the horses and ushering both Daisy and Gus into the house. The interior of the Clancy Street home was every bit as refined as its exterior suggested. Polished furniture, patterned wallpaper, and crystal decanters on a sideboard spoke of wealth and Eastern tastes transplanted to the frontier. Gus looked distinctly out of place amid the finery, his tall frame rigid with discomfort. Richard Bennett, Margaret's husband, proved to be a jovial man with a businessman's shrewdness in his eyes. Upon hearing the story of Daisy's rescue, he insisted that Gus stay for dinner, brushing aside the cowboy's protestations with good-natured determination. "The least we can do is feed you properly before you head back to your cabin," Richard declared. "And the night is already drawing in. You'd be welcome to stay in our guest room and start fresh in the morning." Daisy watched Gus struggle with the invitation, clearly torn between his desire to return to his solitude and his reluctance to appear ungrateful. When his eyes met hers briefly, she offered a small, encouraging smile. One night would be appreciated, Gus finally conceded. "Thank you for your hospitality." Dinner was an elaborate affair compared to the simple meals Gus and Daisy had shared. Margaret presided over the table with practiced grace, keeping conversation flowing between courses of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Richard, it emerged, was involved in Helena's growing banking industry, having moved from St. Louis 2 years prior. "The opportunities out here are extraordinary," Richard expounded, pouring wine for his guests. "Helena's becoming a proper city. We've got opera houses, churches, schools, all the refinements of civilization with the boundless potential of the frontier." "It's certainly grown since I last passed through," Gus observed. 2 years ago, this neighborhood was just open fields. You know Helena well then, Mr. Lawson." Margaret inquired. "I come in for supplies every few months," Gus replied. "Try to keep abreast of changes. World has a way of moving forward whether you're watching or not." "Indeed," Richard agreed. "Are you in the cattle business, mining?" "A bit of both at times," Gus said. "Mostly I trap in winter, guide hunting parties in summer, and keep to myself the rest of the year." A flicker of disappointment crossed Richard's face clearly. He'd been hoping for a potential business connection. "Well, there's a fine living to be made in that, I'm sure." The conversation turned to Daisy's plans, with Margaret enthusiastically outlining the arrangements made for her return east. "Mother Bennett has a lovely room prepared for you in her Boston home," Margaret explained. "And she's already mentioned you to several respected families seeking governesses. With your education and breeding, you'll have no trouble securing an excellent position." Daisy nodded, aware of Gus watching her from across the table. "It's very kind of her to take an interest." Nonsense. Your family, and after everything you've been through, you deserve some stability and refinement again. Margaret patted Daisy's hand. The train leaves in 3 days. That will give us time to have some proper clothes made for you. No offense, dear, but your current wardrobe is hardly suitable for Boston society. Daisy felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. Her uncle's modest means and her own limited resources had necessitated a practical approach to clothing during her time in Montana. The dress she wore navy blue wool with simple trim had been her best, and now Margaret was making it clear that even this was woefully inadequate. Miss Zimmerman manages quite well regardless of her attire, Gus said quietly, his eyes meeting Daisy's. She showed remarkable courage alone in the wilderness. The simple defense warmed Daisy more than she cared to admit. Thank you, Mr. Lawson, but Margaret is right. Eastern standards are different. I'll need to adapt. After dinner, Richard invited Gus to his study for brandy and cigars, a courtesy extended to an unexpected guest, while Margaret took Daisy upstairs to show her the room that had been prepared for her visit. He seems a decent sort, Margaret commented as she opened a wardrobe to reveal several dresses. For a mountain man, rather educated speech for someone of his profession, Mr. Lawson is well read, Daisy replied, running her fingers over the soft fabric of the dresses, clearly Margaret's cast-offs, but still far finer than anything Daisy had worn in years. He has quite a library in his cabin. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You were in his cabin, alone. Daisy felt herself blush again. It wasn't like that. He slept in the stable. He was a perfect gentleman. I'm sure he was, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she found the situation improper regardless. Well, it's fortunate he came along when he did. The West is no place for a woman alone. You'll be much better off in Boston. Later, as Daisy prepared for bed in the comfortable guest room, she found her thoughts returning to Gus and his cabin in the wilderness. There had been a peacefulness there, despite the circumstances that had brought her to it. The simplicity of their shared breakfast, the easy silence as they rode together these moments, had felt more authentic than the elaborate dinner and carefully orchestrated conversation in the Bennett household. She crossed to the window, drawing aside the lace curtain to look out at the night sky. The stars seemed dimmer here in town, obscured by the lamplight from neighboring houses. In the wilderness, they had blazed with unmatched brilliance, a canopy of light above Gus's cabin. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Gus standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable in clean clothes that must have been borrowed from Richard, though they strained across his broader shoulders. Miss Zimmerman, he said, his voice low. I wanted to say goodbye properly. I'll be leaving before dawn tomorrow. So soon? Daisy asked, surprised at the disappointment that swept through her. Mr. Bennett has business associates arriving early, thought it best not to impose. He shifted his weight. I've left Willow here for you. Your mare. Mr. Bennett says he'll arrange for her care until you decide what to do with her. That's very thoughtful, Daisy said, suddenly aware that she was standing in her nightgown and wrapper, her hair in a single braid over her shoulder. She should feel scandalized by the impropriety, but somehow, with Gus, such concerns seemed irrelevant. I also wanted to give you this, he continued, holding out a small leather-bound book. For your journey east. Daisy accepted it, turning it over in her hands. Thoreau, Walden. Thought you might appreciate his perspectives on simplicity and self-reliance, Gus said. Given your experiences, the gift touched her deeply. Thank you, I'll treasure it. Gus nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. I wish you well in Boston, Miss Zimmerman, truly. And I wish you well in your wilderness, Mr. Lawson, she replied softly. He hesitated, as if there was more he wanted to say, but then simply inclined his head in a respectful nod and turned to go. Gus, Daisy called after him, surprising herself with the informal address. He paused, looking back at her. I'm glad it was you who heard my shots that night. A smile genuine and warm transformed his serious face. So am I, Daisy, so am I. With that, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Daisy closed her door and returned to the window, clutching the book to her chest. The thought of never seeing August Lawson again left an unexpected ache in her heart, one that persisted as she finally slipped between the fine sheets of her bed. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. Margaret was determined to prepare Daisy for her return to Eastern society, scheduling fittings with the local dressmaker, arranging her hair in the latest fashion, and instructing her on the changes in Boston etiquette since Daisy had last lived in a city. "The Bennets are very well connected," Margaret explained as they took tea in the parlor. "Mother Bennet's circle includes some of Boston's finest families. The opportunities for you will be excellent, possibly even marriage prospects once you're established." Daisy nodded absently, her gaze drifting to the window where Willow grazed in the small paddock behind the house. The mare had recovered well from her lameness, and watching her brought memories of the journey with Gus. "Daisy, are you listening?" Margaret's voice cut through her thoughts. "I'm sorry, what were you saying?" Margaret sighed. "I was explaining that Mother Bennet's friend, Mrs. Cabot, is seeking a companion for her daughter who is newly engaged. It would be a perfect position, light duties, excellent pay, and access to the finest social circles." "That sounds suitable," Daisy replied, attempting to summon enthusiasm. "Suitable, it's a marvelous opportunity." Margaret studied her with concern. "Daisy, is something troubling you? You've seemed distracted since you arrived." Daisy set down her teacup. "I'm just adjusting, I suppose. Everything here is so different from Uncle William's farm, and different still from—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the comparison to Gus's cabin. "From what?" Margaret prompted. "From what I've grown accustomed to," Daisy finished lamely. Margaret patted her hand sympathetically. "Of course, but you'll readapt quickly to civilization. It's in your blood, after all. This frontier existence was never meant to be permanent for someone like you." The words lingered in Daisy's mind that evening as she packed her new clothes into the trunk Margaret had provided for her journey. Someone like you. What did that mean exactly? 3 years ago, she would have agreed without hesitation that her place was in society, following the prescribed path for a well-bred young woman. But now, after experiencing the rawness and beauty of the West, after seeing women carve out their own destinies here, she wasn't so certain. She picked up the copy of Walden that Gus had given her, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. She'd been reading it each night before bed, finding herself drawn to Thoreau's observations on authenticity and the courage to live deliberately. One passage in particular had resonated deeply. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Was she, Daisy wondered, choosing to live deliberately? Or was she simply following the path of least resistance, accepting what others had decided was best for her? The question haunted her throughout the night and into the morning of her departure. The Bennets accompanied her to the train station, Margaret fussing over the details of her journey while Richard arranged for her trunk to be loaded into the baggage car. "You have the letter for Mother Bennet?" Margaret asked for the third time. "And the tickets? And enough money for meals on the train?" "Yes to all," Daisy assured her, watching as passengers bustled around them, saying goodbyes or hurrying to board. "I'll be fine, Margaret, and I'll telegraph when I arrive." "See that you do," Margaret said, embracing her. "This is the right decision, Daisy. You'll see, Boston will feel like home again in no time." As the final boarding call came, Daisy found herself frozen on the platform, her carpet bag clutched in her hands. Through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of a tall figure in a cowboy hat standing at the far end of the platform, partially obscured by a column. "Gus," she whispered, straining to see clearly. "What was that, dear?" Margaret asked. "Nothing," Daisy said quickly. "I just thought I saw someone I knew." Richard returned from his errand, checking his pocket watch. "You'd better board, Daisy. The train won't wait." Daisy nodded, accepting final hugs from her cousins. But as she turned toward the steps of the passenger car, the crowd shifted, and she saw him clearly, August Lawson, standing quietly at a distance, watching her. Their eyes met across the platform, and something inside Daisy crystallized into certainty. In that moment, she knew with absolute clarity what she wanted. "I can't go," she said, turning back to the Bennets. "What?" Margaret stared at her in confusion. What do you mean you can't go? The train is about to leave. I'm sorry, Daisy said, a weight lifting from her shoulders with each word. I'm not meant for Boston anymore. My life is here now. Daisy, this is absurd, Richard protested. You can't possibly mean to stay in Helena with no prospects. No, I have prospects, Daisy interrupted, surprising herself with her conviction. They're just different from what you imagined for me. She pressed Margaret's hands. Thank you for everything you've done, truly. But this is my decision to make. Before they could argue further, Daisy turned and walked directly toward Gus, who straightened in surprise as she approached. Miss Zimmerman, he said, removing his hat. I came to wish you safe travels. It appears my travels have been postponed indefinitely, Daisy replied, her heart pounding. Or at least redirected. Confusion crossed his features. I don't understand. Neither do I entirely, she admitted, but I know that returning east doesn't feel right, not now, perhaps not ever. She took a deep breath. The West has changed me, Gus. I've only just realized how much. A whistle blew, and the train began to move, steam billowing around them as it pulled away from the station. Daisy didn't look back. What will you do? Gus asked, a cautious hope lighting his eyes. I don't know yet, Daisy said honestly. Helena needs teachers, I've heard, or perhaps I'll try my hand at something entirely different. She met his gaze squarely. But I'd like to figure it out here where I can see the stars properly at night. A slow smile spread across Gus's face. Stars are particularly clear above my cabin, he said carefully, though the accommodations are rustic compared to what you're accustomed to. I found them quite comfortable, actually, Daisy replied, matching his cautious tone, though I wouldn't want to impose. Gus took a step closer. It wouldn't be an imposition, not at all, he hesitated. But people would talk, a woman staying with a man she barely knows. Then perhaps we should get to know each other better, Daisy suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. Properly. With chaperones and social calls and whatever else propriety demands. I'd like that, Gus said softly. Very much. Behind them, Margaret and Richard approached, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Daisy, what on earth are you doing? Margaret demanded. The train has left without you, making a choice, Daisy replied simply. Living deliberately, as Thoreau would say. She turned to Gus. Mr. Lawson, may I present my cousins Margaret and Richard Bennett. Margaret, Richard, this is August Lawson, I believe you've met. Yes, of course, Richard said, eyeing Gus with newfound suspicion. Mr. Lawson, I must ask what your intentions are toward my cousin. Gus stood straighter, meeting Richard's gaze directly. Honorable sir, I came to see Miss Zimmerman off, not to prevent her departure. Yet here she stands, having missed her train, Margaret observed acidly. That was my decision alone, Daisy interjected. Mr. Lawson had nothing to do with it. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group as other passengers and well-wishers streamed past them, the platform gradually emptying now that the train had departed. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at home, Richard finally suggested. People are staring. The ride back to the Bennett home was tense, with Margaret casting reproachful glances at Daisy while Richard maintained a stony silence. Gus had followed on his horse, having declined the offer to join them in the carriage. Once they were settled in the parlor, Margaret wasted no time in expressing her disapproval. Daisy, I cannot believe you would throw away your future on such a whim. What would your father say? My father would want me to be happy, Daisy replied steadily, and to make my own decisions. By rejecting the security and position we've arranged for you, Richard asked. For what? An uncertain existence in a frontier town, for the freedom to choose my own path, Daisy corrected. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, truly. But I've realized that returning east isn't what I want. And what do you want? Margaret challenged. To become a frontier wife to a man you met 3 days ago, Daisy felt heat rise to her cheeks. I hardly think that's what's happening here, isn't it? Margaret pressed. Why else would you abandon all reason if not for some romantic infatuation? Before Daisy could respond, a knock at the front door interrupted the tense exchange. Moments later, the maid appeared. Mr. Lawson is here, sir, she announced to Richard. Show him in, Richard replied after a brief hesitation. Gus entered, hat in hand, his expression serious. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Miss Zimmerman, I apologize for intruding, but I felt it necessary to speak plainly. Indeed, Richard said, gesturing to a chair. Please sit, Mr. Lawson. Gus remained standing. I want to make it clear that I had no intention of disrupting Miss Zimmerman's plans. My presence at the station was merely to wish her well. Yet you must admit the timing is suspicious, Margaret observed. Daisy was perfectly content with her arrangements until she saw you there. If that's true, then I owe her an apology, Gus said, looking directly at Daisy. I would never want to be the cause of discord between you and your family. You have nothing to apologize for, Daisy insisted. As I've said repeatedly, this was my decision, mine alone. Be that as it may, Gus continued, I think it best if I remove myself from the situation. He turned to the Bennets. I came to inform you that I'll be returning to my cabin tomorrow. I have business in town today, but I'll be gone by morning. Daisy felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. Gus, no, he held up a hand. It's for the best, Miss Zimmerman. You should take time to consider your options carefully without complications. The look he gave her conveyed everything he couldn't say in front of her cousin's regret, tenderness, and a promise that this wasn't truly goodbye. Will you at least join us for dinner this evening? Richard offered, somewhat mollified by Gus's display of propriety. As thanks for your assistance to Daisy. That's very kind, but I have arrangements already, Gus replied. Thank you for your hospitality. He nodded to each of them in turn, his eyes lingering on Daisy. Good day. After he left, the parlor fell silent. Daisy stared at the door, a mixture of emotions churning within her: disappointment, frustration, and a determination that only grew stronger with each passing moment. Well, Margaret said finally, perhaps now we can discuss your situation rationally. The next train east leaves in 2 days. We can telegraph Mother Bennet to expect a delay. I'm not taking the next train, Daisy said quietly, or the one after that. Richard sighed heavily. Daisy, be reasonable. What do you propose to do instead? You have no home here, no position, no means of support. I'll find work, Daisy replied. The school needs teachers, or I could assist in one of the shops. And where would you live? Margaret demanded. Surely not with us indefinitely. There are boarding houses for respectable women, Daisy pointed out. Mrs. Hollister's on Pine Street has a good reputation. I'll inquire there tomorrow. Margaret and Richard exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the determination in Daisy's voice. You're serious about this, Richard said slowly. Completely, Daisy confirmed. It's a mistake, Margaret insisted. You're throwing away security and respectability for what? Some romantic notion of frontier independence? Perhaps, Daisy acknowledged, but it's my mistake to make. The next morning, Daisy rose early, packing her few belongings into her old valise rather than the fine new trunk Margaret had provided. She left the new dresses hanging in the wardrobe, taking only what had been hers before practical garments suited to the realities of Western life. She wrote a note for her cousins, thanking them for their hospitality and assuring them of her determination to make her own way. Then, with Willow saddled and waiting, she quietly left the Bennet home as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Mrs. Hollister's boarding house was already stirring when Daisy arrived, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the kitchen at the back of the tidy 2-story building. The proprietress herself, a brisk, gray-haired woman with kind eyes, answered Daisy's knock. Mrs. Hollister. My name is Daisy Zimmerman. I'm in need of lodging and was told you might have a room available. The older woman assessed her with a practiced eye. Single women only in my establishment, Miss Zimmerman, no gentlemen callers in private, and a strict curfew of 9 o'clock. That's perfectly acceptable, Daisy assured her. References? Mrs. Hollister asked. My cousins, the Bennets on Clancy Street, Daisy offered. And Reverend Thomas at the Methodist Church in Bozeman, where I lived previously. Mrs. Hollister nodded, apparently satisfied. Room and board is $8 weekly, payable in advance. That includes breakfast and supper. You're responsible for your own midday meal. That's fair, Daisy agreed, calculating her modest savings. She had enough to cover a few weeks while she sought employment. There's a stable out back for your horse, Mrs. Hollister continued. That's an additional 50 cents weekly for feed and care. She stood aside to let Daisy enter. Room 3 at the top of the stairs. Bathroom is shared at the end of the hall. Breakfast is served from 6 to 8, supper at 6 sharp. Miss any meals and you'll go hungry until the next one. Thank you, Daisy said, relieved at the straightforward arrangement. Is there a place I might stable my horse until I can return for her? I need to inquire about positions at the school. Johnny can take her round back now, Mrs. Hollister replied, calling for a young boy who appeared to be about 14. Johnny, show Miss Zimmerman's horse to the stable, then bring her trunk up to room 3. It's just this valise, Daisy corrected, handing over the reins to the boy. And I'll carry it myself, thank you. Mrs. Hollister raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further as Daisy paid her first week's rent and followed her upstairs to her new accommodations. Room 3 was small but scrupulously clean with a narrow bed, a plain dresser, a washstand, and a small writing desk beneath the single window. The view overlooked the back garden and stable, where Daisy could see Johnny leading Willow toward the small corral. Breakfast in 20 minutes if you want it, Mrs. Hollister informed her. The school's 2 blocks east on Mountain Avenue. Principal's name is Hargrove. He's usually there by 8. Left alone, Daisy unpacked her few belongings, arranging them in the dresser and placing Gus's copy of Walden on the bedside table. She changed into her best remaining dress, a dark green wool that had seen better days but was still presentable, and pinned her hair into a neat chignon. Studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, Daisy barely recognized the woman who looked back at her. Not because of any physical change, but because of the determination she saw in her own eyes. 3 years ago, she would never have imagined herself taking such a decisive step, defying expectations to forge her own path. Wolves, she thought with a wry smile, weren't the only dangers she'd faced nor the most significant ones she'd overcome. After a simple but hearty breakfast with 4 other boarders, all working women ranging from a milliner's assistant to a telegraph operator, Daisy set out for the school. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, the streets of Helena already bustling with activity as businesses opened and wagons rolled past laden with goods. Helena's schoolhouse was a substantial brick building with tall windows and a bell tower, evidence of the town's prosperity and commitment to education. Inside, the halls smelled of chalk dust and beeswax polish, familiar scents that reminded Daisy of her own school days in Philadelphia. Principal Hargrove proved to be a serious man in his 50s with spectacles and a meticulously trimmed beard. He listened attentively as Daisy explained her educational background and experience tutoring her uncle's neighbor's children in Bozeman. We do have a need for an assistant teacher in the primary grades, he acknowledged after examining the references she had brought. Miss Collins is expecting a child and will be leaving her position at the end of the month. The pay is $30 monthly. That would be acceptable, Daisy said, doing quick calculations in her head. It would cover her room and board with a small amount left over enough to get by if she was careful. Have you any experience with younger children? Hargrove asked. The position involves teaching reading, basic arithmetic, and penmanship to children aged 6 to 8. I taught my uncle's neighbor's 3 children, ages 5, 7, and 9, Daisy replied. They progressed well under my instruction. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. The school board would need to approve your appointment, of course. They meet next Tuesday evening. In the meantime, you might assist Miss Collins to familiarize yourself with our curriculum and methods. I would be delighted to, Daisy agreed eagerly. Very well. Report tomorrow morning at 7:30. Miss Collins arrives early to prepare the classroom. He rose, extending his hand. Welcome to Helena Academy, Miss Zimmerman, provisionally at least. Daisy left the school with a lightness in her step that had been absent for months. A position, modest accommodations, and the beginnings of independence, it was more than she had dared hope for just a day ago. As she walked back toward Mrs. Hollister's, her thoughts inevitably turned to Gus. Had he already left for his cabin? Would she ever see him again? The connection between them had been unexpected but undeniable. In the brief time they'd spent together, he had shown her kindness, respect, and a perspective on life that resonated with her own emerging values. Lost in thought, she almost collided with a man leaving the general store. "Excuse me," she began, then stopped abruptly when she recognized him. Gus, August Lawson, looked equally surprised to see her. "Miss Zimmerman, I thought you'd be at your cousin's. I've taken a room at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house," Daisy explained, acutely aware of passers-by on the busy street. "And I've just secured a teaching position at the academy." Gus's expression shifted from surprise to something like admiration. "You work quickly?" "I know my own mind," Daisy replied simply. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "When do you return to your cabin?" "This afternoon," Gus said. "I've finished my business in town." Daisy nodded, disappointment washing over her despite her best efforts. "I see." Gus glanced around, evidently noting the public nature of their conversation. "Would you allow me to walk you back to your boarding house, Miss Zimmerman, if it wouldn't be an imposition?" "I'd like that," Daisy agreed, falling into step beside him. They walked in silence for a moment, navigating around other pedestrians and a loaded wagon creaking down the center of the street. "I admire what you're doing," Gus said finally. "Making your own way, it takes courage." "I had a good example," Daisy replied, glancing up at him. "Someone who lives deliberately, making choices based on his own values rather than others' expectations." A small smile touched Gus's lips. Thoreau would approve. They reached the boarding house too quickly. Daisy hesitated at the gate, reluctant to end their conversation. "Will you come to town again soon?" "I usually make the trip every month or so for supplies," Gus answered. "More often when the weather permits." "I see," Daisy said again, trying to mask her disappointment at the prospect of such infrequent encounters. Gus seemed to be wrestling with something. Finally, he said, "Miss Zimmerman, Daisy, I want to be clear about something. My decision to leave wasn't because I didn't wish to see you again. Quite the opposite." Daisy's heart quickened. "Then why?" "Because your cousins were right about one thing, your reputation matters. And being associated with a solitary trapper with few prospects wouldn't serve you well as you establish yourself here." "Shouldn't that be my decision to make?" Daisy challenged gently. "Perhaps," Gus conceded, "but I would never want to be the cause of difficulty for you." Daisy considered this, appreciating his concern even as she disagreed with his conclusion. "Mr. Lawson, I believe we are both adults capable of navigating society's expectations while still pursuing what matters to us." "And what matters to you, Daisy?" Gus asked, his voice low. "Authenticity," she replied without hesitation. "Living according to my own values, not someone else's, finding meaning in what I do." She met his eyes steadily. "And exploring connections that feel genuine, regardless of what others might think." Gus held her gaze, the intensity in his amber eyes making her breath catch. "Then perhaps when I return to town next month, you might allow me to call on you, properly, with Mrs. Hollister's approval, of course." "I would like that very much," Daisy said, unable to suppress her smile. "Until then," Gus said, tipping his hat to her, "I wish you every success with your new position, Miss Zimmerman." "And I wish you safe travels, Mr. Lawson," Daisy replied. "Keep the wolves at bay." His answering smile, warm and genuine, stayed with her long after he had disappeared down the street. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Daisy settled into her new life. Assisting Miss Collins proved to be both challenging and rewarding, the classroom of 28 lively children requiring constant attention and creativity. By the time the school board formally approved her appointment, Daisy had already developed a deep affection for her young charges. Life at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house fell into a comfortable routine. Her fellow boarders, Jenny, the milliner's assistant, Sarah, the telegraph operator, Beatrice, who clerked at the mercantile, and Louise, who worked as a seamstress, became friends and allies in navigating Helena's social landscape. Evenings were spent in the parlor, sharing stories and advice or reading quietly by the fire. True to his word, Gus returned to Helena exactly 1 month after their parting. Daisy was teaching when he arrived at the school, hat in hand, waiting patiently outside her classroom until the children were dismissed for the day. "Mr. Lawson," she said, pleasure warming her voice as she spotted him in the hallway. "This is a pleasant surprise." "Miss Zimmerman," he replied, his formal address at odds with the warmth in his eyes. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, I've just finished for the day. She gathered her shawl and books. How long will you be in town? 3 days, Gus answered. I've some business with the fur trader and supplies to purchase. He hesitated. I was hoping you might allow me to escort you to supper tomorrow evening, if Mrs. Hollister approves, of course. I'm sure she will, Daisy assured him. She's quite strict but reasonable when it comes to proper social calls. And so began a courtship as unconventional as the two people involved. Once a month, Gus would arrive in Helena, staying at the modest hotel near the livery stable. He would call on Daisy at the boarding house, engaging Mrs. Hollister in respectful conversation before escorting Daisy to dinner, or, as spring arrived, for walks through the town's newly established park. Their conversations ranged widely from books they'd both read to Daisy's experiences, teaching to Gus's observations of wildlife near his cabin. With each visit, Daisy learned more about the man who had saved her from the wolves that autumn night. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had emigrated from Scotland. Educated and destined for a career in law, his path had been irrevocably altered by the Civil War. The horrors he had witnessed as a sharpshooter had left him with a deep aversion to crowds and noise, driving him westward in search of solitude and peace. The mountains don't judge, he explained during one of their walks in late April, the air fragrant with blooming lilacs. They don't expect anything from you except respect. Is that why you live alone? Daisy asked. Because people expect too much, Gus considered this. Partly. And partly because after the war I couldn't seem to fit back into society. Everything felt too small, too confined. He glanced at her. But I'm finding that isolation has its limitations too. The admission, simple but profound, marked a turning point in their relationship. The following month, when Gus came to town, he brought a proposal along with his usual gift of wildflowers. I know my life isn't what you were raised to expect, he said as they sat on a bench in the park, the June sun warm on their faces. I can't offer you the refinements of Eastern society or even the comforts of town life, but I can promise you honesty, respect, and a partnership of equals. Daisy looked into his earnest face, this man who had become so dear to her over the past 8 months. Are you asking what I think you're asking, August Lawson? I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife, Gus confirmed, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. Not now necessarily, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, Daisy didn't hesitate. Yes. Gus blinked, clearly surprised by her immediate response. Yes, just like that, Daisy confirmed with a smile. Though I should warn you, I have conditions. Name them, Gus said, reaching for her hand. I want to continue teaching at least until we have children, Daisy began, and I'll need bookshelves, lots of them. Anything else? Gus asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Yes, Daisy said, her expression growing serious. I want a true partnership, Gus. I know the law says a wife becomes her husband's property, but that's not the marriage I want. Nor the one I want to offer, Gus assured her. I've seen enough of my sister's independence to know that the traditional arrangement isn't the only possibility. He squeezed her hand. We'll build something new together, Daisy, something that works for both of us. The kiss that followed their first was brief but filled with promise, a pledge sealed under the Montana sky. News of their engagement was met with mixed reactions. Mrs. Hollister offered gruff congratulations, extracting a promise from Gus that the wedding wouldn't take place until proper arrangements had been made for Daisy's comfort at the cabin. Principal Hargrove expressed regret at the prospect of losing an excellent teacher, but understood the realities of frontier life. Margaret and Richard Bennett, however, were predictably dismayed. You barely know him, Margaret protested when Daisy visited to share the news. 8 months of occasional meetings is hardly a foundation for marriage. I know him better than many brides know their grooms after years of formal courtship, Daisy countered. We've had real conversations about what matters to us, not just exchanged pleasantries in supervised settings. But his circumstances, Richard interjected. Daisy, the man lives in virtual wilderness. Have you truly considered what that means for your daily life? I have, Daisy assured them, "and we've agreed that I'll continue teaching through the fall term." Meanwhile, Gus is making improvements to the cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a second room for my books and sewing. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "I cannot understand how you could choose such a life over the opportunities waiting for you in Boston." "Because it's the life I want," Daisy said simply. "With the man I love." The wedding took place in late August, a simple ceremony in Helena's Methodist church with Daisy's fellow boarders as attendants and Gus's sister Eliza, who had traveled from Denver, standing with her brother. The Bennetts attended despite their misgivings, Richard giving Daisy away with formal correctness if not enthusiasm. Daisy wore a dress of ivory, silk a gift from Eliza rather than the elaborate gown Margaret had offered to order from St. Louis and carried wildflowers Gus had gathered from the meadows near his cabin. When they exchanged vows, the sincerity in Gus's voice brought tears to more eyes than just Daisy's. The small reception was held at the hotel, with cake and punch for the guests and a special dinner afterward for the immediate wedding party. As twilight fell, Gus and Daisy slipped away to begin their journey to what would now be their shared home. They spent their first night as husband and wife at a small way station halfway between Helena and Gus's cabin, in a private room with a view of the mountains. Nervousness gave way to tenderness as they discovered each other, Gus's reverent touch and patient guidance easing Daisy through the initial discomfort to unexpected pleasure. "I never imagined it could be like this," Daisy whispered afterward, nestled against his chest. "That two people could be so connected." Gus pressed a kiss to her temple. "We're just beginning, love. There's a lifetime of discovery ahead of us." The cabin, when they reached it the following day, was transformed from what Daisy remembered. Gus had been working steadily over the past months, adding a proper bedroom with a larger bed, expanding the main room, and building bookshelves along one wall. A new iron cookstove gleamed in the kitchen area, and curtains sewn by Eliza hung at the windows. "It's not fancy," Gus said as he carried her across the threshold, "but it's ours." "It's perfect," Daisy assured him, taking in the evidence of his labor and thoughtfulness. On the table stood a vase of fresh wildflowers and beside it, a small wooden box. "A wedding gift," Gus explained, setting her down gently. "Open it." Inside, Daisy found a silver pendant on a delicate chain, a star set with a tiny diamond at its center. "So you'll always have a star with you," Gus said as he fastened it around her neck, "even when clouds hide the real ones." That autumn passed in a blur of adjustment and joy. Daisy continued teaching during the week, staying at Mrs. Hollister's Monday through Thursday and returning to the cabin for long weekends with Gus. Though the arrangement was unconventional, it allowed her to fulfill her commitment to the school while they both adapted to married life. By November, when the first heavy snows made travel between Helena and the cabin increasingly difficult, Daisy reluctantly resigned her position. Principal Hargrove had anticipated the decision and had already hired her replacement, though he made it clear that she would be welcomed back should circumstances permit in the future. "You'll be missed, Mrs. Lawson," he said as they said their goodbyes. "Your students in particular have flourished under your guidance." Winter at the cabin proved to be both challenging and unexpectedly rewarding. The isolation that had initially concerned Daisy became a gift uninterrupted time with Gus, quiet evenings reading by the fire, and days spent learning the skills needed for their self-sufficient lifestyle. Gus taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to set snares for rabbits, and to use snowshoes for traversing the deep drifts. Daisy surprised herself with her adaptability, finding satisfaction in mastering tasks she would never have attempted in her previous life. They developed routines that honored both their individual needs and their life as a couple. Mornings began with Gus bringing in firewood and water while Daisy prepared breakfast. Afternoons might find them working together or pursuing separate activities, Gus checking his trap lines while Daisy experimented with preserving food or worked on sewing projects. Evenings were reserved for togetherness. They would read aloud to each other from their growing library, play chess on a board Gus had carved, or simply talk, sharing thoughts and dreams as the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside. You ever miss it? Gus asked one night in January as they lay in bed, listening to the wind howl around the cabin. Town life. People. Daisy considered the question carefully. Sometimes I miss teaching, she admitted. The children's excitement when they grasp a new concept. But I don't miss the constraints of town, the constant awareness of being observed and judged. And your family back east, Gus pressed gently. The life you might have had there. Daisy propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the dim light of the banked fire. Are you having doubts about our arrangement, August Lawson? Never, he assured her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I just want to be certain you're truly content. I am, Daisy said, leaning down to kiss him. More than content. I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with. Her certainty was tested in February when a letter arrived via a passing trapper who stopped at their cabin for shelter from a storm. It was from Margaret, informing Daisy that Richard had business connections who could arrange passage for both her and Gus to Boston, where opportunities awaited that would make better use of your husband's intellect and your refinement. Your cousin is persistent, Gus observed after reading the letter, and not entirely wrong about the opportunities that might be available to us elsewhere. Daisy studied his face. Are you suggesting we consider her offer? I'm suggesting we discuss it, Gus replied carefully. I chose this life because it was what I needed after the war, but I wouldn't want my preferences to limit your possibilities. Or mine to limit yours, Daisy countered. Would you be happier in a city, Gus, practicing law as you once intended? He considered this, his expression thoughtful. I don't think so, not in Boston, certainly. The East holds too many memories. He met her eyes. But I would adapt if it was important to you. The offer touched Daisy deeply. This man who valued his independence so highly would sacrifice it for her happiness. It only confirmed what she already knew. Their partnership was built on mutual respect as much as love. I don't want Boston, she assured him, taking his hand. I want this life we're building together, but perhaps someday we might consider Helena again. Not to live in town, but close enough that I could teach occasionally, and any children we might have would need schooling eventually. Gus nodded, relief evident in his expression. That seems reasonable, a compromise for the future. Spring came late to the mountains that year, the snow lingering into April before finally yielding to warming temperatures and the emergence of wildflowers in the meadows around the cabin. As the world renewed itself, Daisy discovered that she too was nurturing new life. I think I'm with child, she told Gus one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks in gold and pink. I've missed my courses twice now, and there are other signs. Gus's face transformed with wonder and concern. Are you certain? How do you feel? Tired, Daisy admitted with a small laugh, and occasionally sick in the mornings, but mostly joyful. She placed her hand over his. Are you happy about this? Happy doesn't begin to describe it, Gus said, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt before her chair, placing his palm gently against her still flat stomach. A child, our child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into early fall. As Daisy's body changed, so did their plans for the future. The possibility of moving closer to Helena became more pressing with the prospect of a child who would eventually need education and medical care more readily available than their remote location allowed. There's a parcel of land about 10 miles outside of town, Gus told her after returning from a supply run in August. 20 acres with a good spring and enough flat ground for proper farming. The current owner is moving to Oregon and looking to sell quickly. Can we afford it? Daisy asked, resting a hand on her rounded belly. Just barely, Gus confirmed. Between what I've saved from selling furs and the money you set aside from teaching, we could manage the purchase. Building a new cabin would take time, but we could be settled before winter next year if we start planning now. The decision was made, the land purchased, and preparations begun for what would be the next chapter in their shared story. As autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, Daisy's time grew near. They relocated temporarily to Helena, taking rooms at a boarding house that catered to families rather than returning to Mrs. Hollister's. Their daughter, Eleanor, was born on a crisp October morning in 1880, almost exactly 2 years after Daisy and Gus had first met. She arrived with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair that promised to be as unruly as her father's. "She's perfect," Gus whispered, cradling his daughter with hands that trembled slightly. "Absolutely perfect, she is," Daisy agreed, exhausted but radiant, "and she has your eyes." The Bennets visited the following day, bearing gifts and a cautious willingness to reconcile. Margaret was immediately smitten with her little cousin, and even Richard had to admit that Daisy looked well and genuinely happy. "You've proven us wrong," Margaret acknowledged as she reluctantly prepared to leave. "We were certain you were making a terrible mistake, but it's clear you knew your own heart better than we did." "Thank you for saying that," Daisy replied, touched by the admission. "It means a great deal to me." As winter settled over Montana once more, the small family remained in Helena, Gus making regular trips to their new property to begin construction on what would be their permanent home. By spring, the foundation was laid and the frame was rising a larger, more substantial structure than the original cabin, but designed with the same principles of simplicity and functionality in mind. "Room for more children," Gus explained as he showed Daisy the plans during one of her visits to the site, "and space for a proper classroom if you decide to teach again." "You thought of everything," Daisy said, leaning against him as they surveyed what would become their homestead. "I had good motivation," Gus replied, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "A family worth building for." Eleanor was walking by the time they moved into their new home in the late summer of 1881. The house for it was truly a house. Not merely a cabin, had 3 bedrooms, a spacious common area with ample bookshelves, a kitchen with modern conveniences, and even a small attached greenhouse where Daisy could grow herbs and vegetables during the harsh winter months. "It's more than I ever dreamed," Daisy said as they stood together on the porch on their first evening, watching the stars emerge above the distant mountains while Eleanor slept peacefully inside. "Not quite finished yet," Gus pointed out. "The barn still needs work, and I want to build a proper workshop eventually." "We have time," Daisy reminded him, sliding her arm around his waist. "A lifetime to build exactly what we want together." As the years passed, their family and homestead flourished. A son, William, joined them in 1883, followed by another daughter, Sarah, in 1886. The land produced abundant gardens and eventually an orchard, while Gus's skills as a hunter and trapper ensured they never lacked for meat or the income that furs provided. True to her original plan, Daisy returned to teaching part-time once the children were older, first in their home where neighboring families sent their children, and later, as Helena's outskirts expanded toward their property, in a proper schoolhouse built on land they donated for the purpose. Through it all the joys and challenges, the harsh winters and glorious summers, they remained steadfast in their commitment to the partnership they had envisioned on that bench in Helena's park. Equals in decision-making, parenting, and the daily work of building a life together. On the 20th anniversary of the night Gus had saved Daisy from the wolves, they sat on the porch of their home, watching their children, now nearly grown, play a spirited game of horseshoes in the yard. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't heard my shots that night?" Daisy asked, her hand entwined with Gus's as it had been countless times over the years. "Sometimes," Gus admitted, "but then I remember what my father used to say about fate." "What was that?" "That doesn't control us, but it does open doors. We still have to choose to walk through them." He lifted their joined hands to his lips. "I'm grateful every day that we both chose to walk through the door that opened for us that night." "As am I," Daisy said softly. "Even when the wolves closed in on my camp, I couldn't have imagined the life waiting on the other side of that darkness." "It's been quite a journey," Gus agreed, watching as their eldest daughter landed a perfect ringer, her laugh carrying across the yard. "And still continuing," Daisy reminded him, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light of day gilded the mountains that had become their home. "Still continuing." In the distance, a lone wolf howled a sound that once had signaled danger, but now served as a reminder of the wild beauty that had brought them together and the love that had transformed both their lives. As surely as August Lawson's shots had transformed that terrifying night into the first chapter of their shared story.